Hello and welcome to a live webcast with LaRoucheSupport TV. My name is Matthew Ogden. I'm an editor with LaRoucheSupport.com, and I'd like to welcome you to this live event that we're holding, hosted by LaRoucheSupport.com. It's November 19th, 2011. We have live audiences gathered all over the United States, in New York City, in Boston, in San Francisco, in Seattle, Los Angeles, Houston, in Detroit, and also I know audiences that are gathered around the world to watch and participate in the proceedings that we are hosting here today. Joining us today are featured guests from the LaRoucheSupport scientific research team, The Basement, Cody Jones and Peter Martinson. And we meet here today under very tense circumstances, largely because Barack Obama is still the President of the United States. And every day Obama remains in office, as Lyndon LaRouche has warned in no uncertain terms, we are carried ever closer to the potential of a thermonuclear war, which threatens the extinction of the entire human race. Now, we've seen this through his intentionally provocative behavior during Barack Obama's current trip into the Asia-Pacific region. We've also seen the intentional escalation of the conflicts in Iran and Syria. But the intention of this is no less than a nuclear confrontation between the United States and allied powers versus Russia and China. Now the question is, whose intention is this? This is not Barack Obama's intention alone. The intention of a thermonuclear genocidal war is the intention of the British Empire. And the British Empire, as LaRouche has made it very clear, is the current manifestation of an oligarchical principle which has existed for thousands of years and plagued this planet, an anti-human principle which has existed since before the Trojan Wars. And before the Trojan Wars, as we've seen in written documentation, this oligarchical principle has preached the doctrine of population reduction, genocide against the human species. Now, the actions by Lyndon LaRouche over the recent 2 weeks to boldly declare that this is the intention of the British Empire and their puppet, Barack Obama, in the White House, has sparked a significant resistance inside leading circles in the United States at the highest level to stop Obama's drive for war. But as Mr. LaRouche made very clear this morning, we cannot rest on our laurels and talk about buying time or stopping this particular war or that, or to think that actions taken inside the United States alone are sufficient to stop this threat. As long as the British Empire continues to exist, the threat of thermonuclear war continues to exist, because this is the oligarchy's stated intention. Now, what you're going to see today here is a reflection of the reason why this organization, and Mr. LaRouche in particular, is considered the mortal enemy of that empire. Our enemy recognizes LaRouche as such, and that should be very clear to anybody who's watching this broadcast today if you understand the exemplary role of Lyndon LaRouche in an event which occurred almost 30 years ago, what was called the SDI, or the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was a policy which was proposed by Lyndon LaRouche, adopted by Ronald Reagan, but unfortunately was rejected under British orders by the Soviet Union in 1983. However, the ghost of this SDI is what is still continuing to shape world politics today. This still represents the foremost principle shaping world history as we speak. And the stakes right now are equal, if not greater, to the stakes that existed at the time that SDI was first proposed. Now, if we look at the current situation, both the collapse of the transatlantic financial system and the threat of global thermonuclear war, both of these are the direct results of the processes and counter-processes which were set in motion by Lyndon LaRouche's proposal for the Strategic Defense Initiative in the early 1980s. When the SDI was rejected by British orders by the Soviet Union at that time, LaRouche forecast that not only would the Soviet Union collapse within 5 years, which happened right on schedule, but also the collapse of the transatlantic system would follow shortly thereafter, the next shoe to drop. And that is where we are today. So if you look at the current collapse of the transatlantic system, and then look at the threat of nuclear war, the only reason why the option still exists for the British Empire to use thermonuclear war to exterminate the human species is because the SDI was rejected by the Soviet Union in 1983. If it had been implemented, the option for thermonuclear war itself would not exist today. And the opportunity for the British Empire to use this weapon to exterminate the human species would have been off the table long ago. However, as we learned a little bit over a month ago, there are motions inside the highest circles at the very highest level of the Russian government to put SDI back on the table today. What we've learned is that under the heading of the SDE, what's being called now the Strategic Defense of Earth, very high levels in the Russian government have now decided that SDI is back. And this is the only option for the survival of the human species and the ultimate defeat of the British Empire and the oligarchical principle. So this is exactly the same principle as the SDI to transform what would be a nuclear confrontation between Russia and China versus the United States and the West, turn that into a collaboration and to address not the wars that are artificially created by the British Empire on this planet, but to address the threats that the human race is facing at this current moment, which are extraterrestrial in their origin. Now, that takes us directly to the subject matter that we will be addressing here today. So without further ado, I'll explain to people, we will begin with a short opening presentation by Peter Martinson. That will be followed by some opening remarks by Cody Jones as well. Then we'll be taking questions that are coming in from our live audience, and we encourage everybody who's watching to send your questions in as you participate to the email address which you can find on this website. It's info.larouchepack@gmail.com. info.larouchepack@gmail.com. So thank you for tuning in today, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you Peter Martinson.
Thanks, Matt. All right. Now, one way or another, the current British Empire, which is the current representation of an old system called the oligarchical principle, one way or another, very soon, this British Empire is going to cease to exist. Now, there are various ways that this is going to come about, but the entire system is collapsing right now. People have seen, it's pretty obvious, the global economic system is finished. You look at what's happening in the United States and you look at what's happening in Europe, the system is gone. Now, that represents the end of the British monetary system, which is why they're going for thermonuclear war. Their system is finished. The attempt to get a thermonuclear war going by getting the United States under Obama to uncork the nuclear bottle into not just Southeast Asia, but into Russia and over China, this is a death spasm of the British Empire. This system is finished. Now, the only question that's on the table, it's not the continuation of the British Empire. They're goners. The only question is, are they going to take the rest of civilization down with them? All right, and that's the issue that I'm going to address right now, because we're faced with two options: thermonuclear war and a collapse of the world economy, which means the reduction of the world's population to less than 2, possibly 1 billion people. The British Empire is calling for less than 1 billion people publicly now. Either the reduction of the world's population rapidly to those levels, or the elimination of the British Empire. We can put them in a museum somewhere so that we can learn from our younger age mistakes, and the expansion of man's conquest into space. We are destined to become a spacefaring creature if we can put down the British Empire without them taking us out. So what I'm going to go through is how the British Empire as an ancient oligarchical system works, to how it's worked up till now, what we're actually up against. Now, the system is very, very old. The so-called The British Empire is just a modern representation of this old system called the oligarchical system, which has its roots in the story of Prometheus versus Zeus. Now, I assume that people who are watching this presentation right now, some of you are familiar with this story. What's the issue? Prometheus was not a god. Prometheus was one of the titans, one of the forebears of the so-called Olympian gods, Zeus and the rest of the gaggle. Prometheus created man. The gods came in and took power and treated man as their plaything. Zeus is the most famous example of this. The human beings were always the chess pieces that were moved around, the toys that were played with, that were messed around with. If you wiped out civilization here or there, it didn't matter because they're just animals, they're playthings. Now Prometheus, who is known for his abilities of forecasting and foresight, saw this as a great wrong. And there's good evidence that this story is based in truth, but it was turned into an actual legend. Prometheus thought that this was terrible, that the gods were treating man like this. So Prometheus came down and gave man, among other things, the power of wielding fire, which it's a higher technology than, hunting down roots and berries and, throwing rocks at animals to, get them and eat them. Fire is a higher development of technology and requires an insight into universal principles. From our standpoint today, it'd be possibly primitive universal principles, but it requires an insight into processes of the universe. So Prometheus gave man fire, among other things like medicine, the powers of astronomy, the powers of understanding how the nature of the wanderers in the sky, to look at how that impacts your life on the earth. Prometheus gave man the ability to do science. Now, the result of that was that Zeus got, extremely angry and stuck Prometheus on a rock and had his liver eaten out every day for 10,000 years, under condition that Prometheus didn't care about that. What he cared about was man getting its power back over these gods. Now, the system it's an old system, all right? It's called the oligarchical system, and it's totally in power. It's totally in play today. The system is, you have an oligarchy, a small group of people who consider themselves a higher species of organism than the rest of the population. That they believe that all creatures on the planet are animals, including humans, and that they're a higher order of species. Therefore, they have the right to enslave and keep man as cattle, the rest of the population. So the game is, how do you keep your power? Now, man having the ability to be creative and make discoveries and increase his power over the universe, that creative power is the number one threat to the existence of an oligarchy. So this is where the nature of oligarchical strategy comes in, if you can call it strategy. The method is, how do you get people to forget that they're creative, believe that they're animals, and stop acting like humans? That's the game. How do you repress scientific and technological progress? How do you repress creative activity among humans? And as a corollary, how do you keep the population of human beings down so that you can manage them as a manageable group of cattle? So the oligarchy, going all the way back to Zeus and then all the way up to today, is instinctively acts against, to repress creativity, human creativity. So this is what we're up against. Now let's look at President Obama. President Obama, after launching his, after having succeeded in pushing through his Hitler T4 healthcare policy, which should be called a death care policy. People might remember the death panels, which exist now. After that got rammed through, over the protests of most of the population of the United States, the next step was to take down the capability of human spaceflight, NASA. And I'll go through a couple of details on this. Early on, after the healthcare policy went through, the Obama and the Office of Management and Budget under Peter Orszag launched a campaign to stop what was probably the only thing that was worth anything good that came out of the Bush administration. I'm no fan of the Bush administration. Bush was almost the worst president we've ever had in the United States, the most destructive president we've ever had in the United States, until we got Obama. But the Bush administration did launch the so-called Constellation program, which is the next step, or would have been the next step, of human spaceflight, which included missions to the moon. It included constructing craft that would be a potential path to colonizing other planets in the solar system, like Mars, starting with the moon. Obama and his groupies, the so-called behaviorists, launched a campaign to shut this thing down. Launching the campaign threw Congress into complete disarray, launched NASA into complete disarray. We started having hearings on Capitol Hill where Neil Armstrong and some of the other original Apollo astronauts had to testify for the first time in their lives. This is the first time that Neil Armstrong ever testified in front of Congress, testifying that the shutdown of NASA was not done through, the shutdown of manned spaceflight was not done through any collaboration or consultation with anybody involved in the science or in NASA. It was done by a small, secret, select group around Obama, intentionally to shut down the ability to do manned spaceflight. The status now is that the whole program is in disarray. And there's some people that believe that they've secured a heavy launch vehicle until the next presidential election, but I would submit that as long as President Obama is in the White House, we are seeing the end of manned space. Now, simultaneously, as the gutting of the manned space program was underway, some people got opportunistic and said, well, we're for robotic space exploration, science. We're for sending probes into space. Manned space program costs too much money, so we're going to support probes. So it was an opportunistic throwing the manned space program to the wolves. Now it's coming out that the Obama administration is hell-bent on shutting down the space probes to other planets. For example, right now, Europe, the European Space Agency, has been ditched by the United States on a very important Mars mission to bring return samples from the surface of Mars back to the Earth. The European Space Agency is now having to go to Russia for collaboration because the United States had to duck out of it because of the opposition of the the Obama administration. What we're dealing with, first of all, the space program it has never been what it was intended to be. The manned space program and the corollary, which is sending instruments into space, is the core of man's ability to survive in the universe. Not specifically because we like going into space, but because man's survival in the universe depends on scientific and creative breakthroughs in understanding the processes that create and drive our universe. The only way we make those breakthroughs, which we've seen through the history of science on the Earth, is by pushing the boundaries of knowledge and pushing the boundaries of capabilities, human capabilities. Right now, those boundaries lie in space. So the Obama administration and the Bush administration, but the Obama administration particularly, is acting as the worst battering ram against the forefront of human science, the worst battering ram of anything that we've ever seen in the history of man, from what I can tell. This is a British operation. Anybody who thinks that you can negotiate with Obama on this, we can, Congress has just passed the, continuing resolution budget in order to fund certain things in NASA. If you think that you can make negotiations with Obama and save any aspect of the space program, you're wrong. Because Obama is not a human being. He's human in biology, but Obama is a creation of the British Empire. He's not just a British agent, he's a British operation. Obama's mission is to destroy the United States and destroy the human population, the human civilization around the world. That's why he's going after NASA. That's why he's going after space program. That's why he's going after every aspect of science. As long as he's in there, if he remains until 2013, if we perchance survive a thermonuclear war, which is what they're gunning for now, earlier than expected, we'll have no space program, and therefore we'll have no avenue for making new discoveries in space. This is a British operation, and it's typically British. This is just an example of how the British, as an extension, as the modern representation of the oligarchical principle going all the way back to Prometheus, this is just an example of how the British operate. This is an example of the oligarchical instinct. Now, what does the oligarchy do? In order to suppress science, besides just rampant, ham-fisted bashing like the Obama administration is doing, the oligarchy, the British as the prime example, produce what can be called synthetic religions to replace real science. There's a real scientific current in among the human race. For example, if you look at the discoveries, starting with Plato, there's a current of scientific work. Plato, through Cusa, through Johannes Kepler's work in astrophysics, through Leibniz, through Carl Gauss, his student Bernard Riemann, through one of the followers of Riemann, Albert Einstein, through Russian biogeochemist Vladimir Vernadsky, up through Lyndon LaRouche today, we have a current of science, a current of real scientific discovery, which has as its core the idea that man has the ability to recognize that the universe that's presented to your senses is not the real universe. The universe that's presented to your senses is a universe of shadows. Man has established that he can recognize that those shadows are shadows being generated by principles that are not, they can be modeled, but they're not sense-perceptible entities. The principles that create sense perceptions are not themselves able to be sensed by any type of sense perception. So as, for example, Kepler showed, what man can do is he can take an individual sense and exhaust the possibilities of that sense, exhaust all the measurement abilities of that sense. Kepler concentrated on vision, visual geometry, and audible geometry, sound, developing the musical scale, how the human sense of sound works. And then he exhausted the possibilities at his time, and then applied that to a discovery of universal gravitation by showing that you have the same principle expressing itself in two different sense-perceptual realms, two different frequencies, you could say. And it presents itself differently in those two frequencies. The task is to understand that you're dealing with a principle that's representing itself differently, and then to adduce, through a power of the creative mind, what is the principle that's generating those sense perceptions. Through that process, Kepler made his discovery of universal gravitation. And just to give a sense of what type of world we're living in such that that's possible, we have a universe which is it's composed such that the human mind has the ability to discover such principles. It's composed such that it will present us senses which have within them gaps, because the principles are not reflected accurately through the senses. But it's through the human mind that you can recognize the gaps in any of those sense perceptions and then deduce what the principle is. The universe is constructed like that. The universe is constructed according to mind. The universe expresses in itself creativity. And we see this, and I'm going to show a couple of examples of this in just a minute. But what we have is a universe that's an anti-entropic, developing universe, which is developing towards higher and higher energy flux densities. This is reflected in the ability of man to make those discoveries and increase his own power over those principles, and thus control and run and develop in a more and more beautiful way the universe around him. That's how the universe is constructed. Now, the way the oligarchy works is it creates synthetic religions to replace this view of man, this divine view of man. The core of the synthetic religions, and not all religions are created by the oligarchy. For example, you look back at Emperor Nero, who was the head of the Roman Empire for a time. Some might say he was the ass of the Roman Empire for a time. But Nero did not burn druids in his backyard for light at night in order to compose his poetry by. He burned Christians at the stake in his backyard to provide light for his writing bad poetry. All right, so not all religions are created by an oligarchy, but the religions that are created by an oligarchy are the ones that are accepted. And there's some characteristics of the religions that come up over and over and over, and you'll recognize some of these. The two most important are, one, that man is not divine. Man is merely one type of animal, one type of living creature on the earth. We also have cows. We also have, mice. We also have grasshoppers. Man is just maybe a little bit more complex, one of those. Man is an animal. There is no divine spark in man. That's number one. Number two is that your senses are giving you an accurate view of the universe. Or if your senses are not giving you an accurate view of the universe, at the very least, the universe operates on principles of sense perception. Therefore, everything that happens in the universe has to be explained in terms of sense perception. That's number two. Now, as an example of this, look at the prototypical British operation named Isaac Newton, who is not, he was another person. Maybe he had something going for him when he was really young, but he turned into a total operation, which was almost an operation out of his own hands. It's not even clear that he wrote the books that are attributed to him. He was a result of a British committee to create a synthetic religion. What is a religion? The universe is composed of an empty box. We have a universe that's empty, and within that empty box, there are objects floating around. Particles, little tiny particles, really, really tiny particles. Everything is made up of these particles, and they interact by ricocheting off each other, collisions. So therefore, an accurate representation of the universe has to be one that's built up from that as its fundamental axiom. The universe is empty, and you have little balls ricocheting off each other. And this leads into every other aspect of the religions that were created since Isaac Newton. All right, everything has to be explained in terms of a universe that's composed of little tiny hard balls that build up into all the phenomena that we see. For example, the second law of thermodynamics is built up from this concept. The concept is that gases, which you can't see, are made up of little tiny particles that are ricocheting off each other. There's so many of them that you need to have statistics to explain what these little tiny balls are going to do. But a result of it is that over time, they kind of even out and the ricochets kind of slow down after a while, and you reach what's called a heat death. It's called the increase of entropy, one of the formulations of the second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is becoming, over time, essentially more and more dead, more and more dull, more and more boring, towards a heat death, the end of heat, which is ridiculous, that the universe is running down. And I'm going to show in a moment, this is a completely ridiculous idea, which is based on this religion created by the British. For example, where does this come in today? Pagan environmentalism. All right? Environmentalism is a pagan religion. It's a religion of death. It's a religion that man is a creature, worse than monkeys. Man is worse than cattle. Man is worse than bugs, worse than bats. If you listen to the British Queen's consort, man is an animal, and he's using up the resources. We only have a finite amount of resources, and man's using them up. He's increasing the rate of entropy. When what we have to do is we have to sustain entropy. We have to slow down entropy and keep things as stable. Man accelerates things. Man creates disequilibriums, which is leading towards the death of the death of the planet, the death of all the other animals, which are more important than man. All right, it's a pagan religion. It's a pagan belief. And for example, yesterday a report came out. It's obviously a pagan belief. None of this stuff is science. This is a pagan religion. There's no, you can debate the scientific merits if you want to, but at the basis, the belief is a religion. It is not science. It's anti-science. It was designed to bury real science. And for example, it pokes through periodically. Yesterday, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with its interim report on climate change. They're coming out with their new report in 2014. This is their interim report. The one in 2007 didn't go too well. So this is the interim report, which is claiming that all of the extreme weather events that we've been having, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a second too. All the extreme weather events that we've been having are due to global warming. That's what's being reported. If you read the report, though, it's very wishy-washy. They say it's really difficult to prove that global warming is causing these extreme weather events. They say, well, we think that temperatures are going to go up, but we can't quite prove it. We think that droughts are going to become more and more important, more and more prevalent because of global warming, but we can't prove it. We think that hurricanes are going to get more terrible, but we can't prove it. We can't prove it on the basis of global warming. It's because it's a religion. But the way it's being reported is that global warming is destroying the Earth through these horrible weather events, and man is to blame, because man is the disequilibrium animal. So it's a religion. This is just typical British crap. It's typical crap of the oligarchical system. Now, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into this, but just to reiterate, we're dealing with a dying empire. This is the end of the oligarchical system. Regardless of what happens, this system is finished. If the system doesn't finish itself, the galaxy is going to finish this system. And this is a system that's been around for well over 2,000 years. We're at the end of an arc of history that's at least 2,000 years old, which was marked by the domination of an oligarchy with opposition that popped up periodically. The most important opposition was the American Republic, the Revolutionary War in the United States. But this system is finished. The question is, what's going to come out of it? A dead planet or a spacefaring culture, which was the original intent of the Americas. Now let's look at the weather for a moment. We have been having a lot of wild weather recently. If you look, since 2007, the number of billion-dollar disasters that have struck the United States has gone steadily up. This year it's been 14 disasters in the United States that have amounted to $1 billion or more. The latest one was this freak snowstorm that nailed the Northeast, which right now is being clocked at about $3.5 billion worth of damage. All right? It is becoming more and more damaging, not just in the United States. Look at the floods in Thailand. This is probably going to affect very poorly the price of rice on the global market. Look at the disasters that have befallen Russia, the droughts, the floods in Pakistan, the monsoons that hit China. Look at the intense cold that hit Europe last year. All right? Things are getting more and more extreme on our planet in terms of weather. Is this due to global warming? No. Throughout the history of our planet, we have faced extinctions of life. Life has existed on the Earth for as long as we know, going all the way back. To quote Vladimir Vernadsky, nobody has ever discovered the beginning of life. In the oldest rocks that we have on the Earth, we have evidence of life. For 500 million years, half a billion years, which is only a tenth of our history, we've had multi-celled life on the planet. The history of that multi-celled life has displayed periodic extinctions, where the diversity of organisms on the planet suddenly drop. Like, for example, the dinosaurs. Obviously, we don't have dinosaurs running around on the Earth. Contrary to what some may believe, there are no dinosaurs on the Earth right now. Maybe birds. But dinosaurs, as like the large, gigantic creatures walking around on the surface of the Earth, they're gone. They were wiped out 65 million years ago. 250 million years ago, there was another very large extinction where 98% of all creatures in the oceans, 96% of all creatures on the land were just eliminated. Nobody knows why. This has happened over and over and over in the recorded history of multicelled life on the Earth. Now, there are characteristics that have to be looked at. which are coming out in recent research just over the past several days. Each of these extinction events, which should be looked more as transformation events, each of these extinction events were marked by specific occurrences. One is the impact of meteorites and large bolides, like, you know, the famous dinosaur killer, which probably wasn't the dinosaur killer. Back at the Permian Triassic extinction 250 million years ago, very good evidence that there were several meteorite impacts around that time. Now a new one is being investigated in France, an impact that wiped out the creatures around the Triassic, the end of the Triassic. Every one of these has meteorite impacts. Every one of these extinctions also includes massive volcanic activity. For example, it appears that the volcanic activity 65 million years ago around India, the Deccan Traps, was a very short-lived but intense period of volcanism. The Siberian Traps 250 million years ago, same thing. Every one of these extinctions has volcanism. Every one of these extinctions has apparent shifts in the motions of the continents, the creation of supercontinents, the elevation of the land level to higher elevations to wipe out any internal seas and oceans. Each one of these extinctions is marked by massive changes on the Earth. Also changes in just to be complete, changes in the type of organism. They're very rapid and they're periodic. But the changes in types of organism, each extinction event would select out whole categories of creatures to die and to live. So the point is that our planet suffers extinctions, and each of these extinctions display the fact that it's not something that happens peculiar to the Earth, but that it's a change in the whole solar system environment that we're going through, which potentially causes the changes on the surface of the Earth. We don't know what increases or decreases volcanism on the Earth. We don't know what increases or decreases the likelihood of earthquakes and other massive tectonic motions of continents, like we've been seeing recently with these gigantic earthquakes we've been having. In fact, if you look at the number of large earthquakes we've been having over the past decade, it's been increasing rapidly, culminating with the last very large earthquakes we've had this year and last year, Japan, Haiti, Chile, etc. Look at the rate of volcanism as it's going up. Look at the near-Earth asteroids that are now passing our planet. All right, our system is changing, and it's very apparent that we're due for another one of these massive extinction events. So, the whole system is changing. You look at what's happening on the Earth with the weather. As I've been going through in several of my weather reports, and has been known since the mid-'70s, since we launched the manned space program, most of the effects of weather that we have on the Earth, cyclones, tornadoes, hurricanes, simple rain, increases and decreases of surface temperature, changes of temperature in the oceans, are primarily due to changes in what happens located at the sun. If you look at our solar system, from the outside, what you see is that the solar system is the sun, plus a little tiny speck called Jupiter, and then some dust floating around in the solar system. That's the solar system. All right? The sun is the dominant creature in our solar system. You'd think that that would impact the changes on the surface of the Earth, which is where cosmic radiation from the sun is being transformed into activity on the surface of the Earth. Now, what do we know about the sun? According to recent observations, the magnetic field of the sun is right now dropping precariously low, going into the end of this current solar cycle. It's very likely that over the next... And the magnetic field is one of the most important things for the interaction of the Earth and the sun, because it mediates the impact of cosmic rays. It mediates the solar wind that's coming into our system. It mediates everything. It interacts with our own magnetic field. It directs charged matter and plasma into or away from our planet. The magnetic field is dropping rapidly, so that by 2020, 2023, the magnetic field may be so weak that we might not be able to measure it. Now, this is coming on, and some people are forecasting that it will be a so-called Maunder minimum, which is the last time we saw anything like this. But nobody knows what generates the magnetic field on the sun. Nobody knows what generates sunspots. This is the big debate right now. Nobody knows what's generating the processes on the sun. It might not be fusion at the center of the sun. It might be something that's extrasolar. Now, if you look at where we are in the galaxy right now, pull up this graphic. Right now, our solar system, which is represented here in this image from NASA, is artist representation of our galaxy, which, according to the best estimates, our galaxy right now has 4 spiral arm density waves, and then several small pieces of arms, which are scattered throughout. Our sun right now, in our solar system, is right now passing into the Orion spur, which is call it an armlet, piece of an arm, which is typically the area when the arm sweeps past our sun. That's typically the time where you start to see mass extinctions on the Earth. Perhaps the sweeping of this system by the galaxy, sweeping it across the sun, is what's generating the changes in the solar activity, and thus the weather activity and the tectonic and volcanic activity on the Earth. So this is where we are right now. We're passing into a mass extinction period because of the changes in what's happening around us in our galaxy. So what we're dealing with is a galaxy that is acting as one organism, and we see various changes around the galaxy that are indicating this. For example, the Crab Nebula, one of the earliest astronomical phenomena that was observed besides planets and stars, was in 1054 when the Chinese documented the observation of this supernova, what we think is a supernova, the creation of what now we recognize as the Crab Nebula. What is the Crab Nebula? We have no idea. What we do know is that it's a very strong source of cosmic rays. We also know that it's a very strong source of gamma radiation. This is just recent studies. It's not only a strong source of very high energy gamma radiation, but it periodically flares up in these large, short-lived flares of gamma radiation activity. We know now, based on recent investigations at CERN and other particle accelerators, that gamma rays and cosmic rays have the ability and are possibly the main source of generation of weather systems on the Earth. For example, the generation of clouds through cosmic rays is now a well-established fact after the work of Svensmark and others. The generation of clouds by gamma rays could very well occur through the same processes. We know gamma rays are involved very closely now with the production of lightning systems, which is very closely associated with thunderstorms, hence the name. So we need to be watching. The whole galaxy is acting up right now and sweeping this area over our sun. We need to be watching what's happening in the rest of the galaxy in order to forecast what's happening here on the Earth. So the point is this. If the British Empire wins, which means launching thermonuclear war, it will be very terrible, and you'll probably see the drop of our population to less than 1 billion people through the warfare, through the nuclear weapons, through disease, through hunger, and so forth. But what we have in store for us is even more devastating, an extinction of the species. Now, if we get rid of Obama, which is the prerequisite, and the British Empire, we can dump the British Empire and launch the real American system worldwide, which is what we're intending, in collaboration with the other key nations on the planet, such as Russia and China, then it's a different story. Can we avoid the extinction? Yes. Man is a cosmic being. The universe is designed around the concept of man. The universe is designed for man. The universe expresses creativity. After every single one of these extinction events, you did see the increase, not just of the complexity of the biological system, the biosphere, but an increase in energy flux density expressed by the biosphere. The biosphere got better and better and better. It wasn't because of the extinctions. It was in spite of the extinctions. The extinctions allowed the increase of energy flux density to be very obvious to our scientists. But the anti-entropic development of life on the Earth is an inherent principle. Now, we might not survive the extinction, but we can. Now, I'll end with this. Matt mentioned this proposal of the Russians to relaunch LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative in the form of this Strategic Defense of the Earth. Now, this is very interesting. First of all, yes, it would defend humanity from a nuclear war because you could take out nuclear weapons with the space-based weaponry. It would mean collaboration between Russia and the United States, and probably China also. If you look, the Chinese and the Russians are very close in terms of their science activity right now, represented, for one, by this the unfortunate Phobos Grunt satellite, which was a Russian satellite carrying a Chinese probe to orbit Mars, including a tiny capsule of living organisms designed in the United States. All right, it's a symbol of the potential collaboration that could exist under this the SDE, the Strategic Defense of the Earth. But what that really represents is a mission for our military. Our military, the tradition of the United States military, which was copied around the world after the early history of the United States. Originally, our military was based on Lazare Carnot's and Monge's École Polytechnique in France. We modeled our West Point system on that. Our military is not primarily a military that shoots and kills people. That's not the mission of our military. Our military is trained to do that, but in order to further goals that don't include death of people. Our military is designed as a scientific engineering capability. If you look at the early history of NASA, who were the original astronauts? These were military officers. The military's mission should be directed towards defending civilization in space. Space is the direction of the military. This is the future job of our military. It's not to have it's too expensive to have wars on our planet now because you have the threat of nuclear weapons all the time. We can't have wars. They're worthless anyhow. Most of them are being driven by the British. If you look around the world right now, all the major wars were started by the British. All the little revolutions and so forth. You can always find the British spoor in the background. For example, it's kind of funny that Iran has this interesting term for the British Empire. They call them the old fox, because the fox is the image in Persia of deceit. But one thing about the old fox is that the old fox gets cowardly when driven into a corner. If you're about to beat the pulp out of the British, they'll, spasm, try to launch a nuclear war, and then get all cowardly. All right? All the wars on the planet right now can be brought back to the British. If we end that, there's no reason for war. We turn our military's engineering capability to space. And then we can start doing real weather forecasting. Because yes, the extinction's on its way, but the way we defeat that is not by turning the sun off or turning off the galaxy or something like that. We do that through forecasting the future and then acting based on those forecasts. We have the potential to become the universe's first immortal species. And it may turn out to be that we're not the only immortal species, but I'm sure the other immortal species would benefit from meeting us at some point. So, with that, turn it over to Cody Jones.
All right, so I'm going to pull a couple of threads from the tapestry which Peter has just woven for you. And in doing so, really challenge a number of what I presume are conceptions that most people have about space, about time, and about the nature of the very universe itself, including your idea about the nature of man. Now, as was brought up by Peter earlier, the conception has been sort of forced upon the thinking of mankind that were you to somehow remove everything from the universe, that what you would be left with would be some sort of empty box of space, infinitely extended in three directions, and that combined with that would be this other sort of infinite expanse known as time. And that really is what is a priori and ontological about our universe. And everything must take place and unfold relative to these infinitely extended conceptions of space and time. That's what's in dispute now. Now, when people think about, say, scale, about size, about space, you sort of have this idea that you have, from our perspective, from our vantage point in our given scale, you sort of have two directions in which you can go. You can either go into the increasingly small of space, or you can go out to the increasingly large of space. And that both of those, though, have some sort of physical boundary to them. That hypothetically, and it's really an idea which again is foisted on people, that if you were to go deep enough into space and into the material of space, you would eventually reach the fine building block of all substance. You know, the very smallest element upon which everything is built up, some little hard ball. And that if you were to then go and extend as far as you could physically, you would reach the end of space. And it's now discussed, well, and this all stems from what occurred out of the Big Bang. And that some 15 billion years ago you had this Big Bang event which occurred in this box of space and time, and that it's been expanding ever since, and hypothetically we can sort of locate where that boundary is. And so from our vantage point you have two directions. You can go in or you can go out. What I would contend, and the history of mankind in this universe demonstrates this to be true, is that in fact there really is only one direction. That what we consider as extending out and going in are actually bound by one single direction of creative progress. That it's through an increased density of creative progress that we actually increase mankind's power to both go deeper into the substance of the universe, but then also extend man's reaches farther out towards the stars. And I'll get at that with just looking at the history, and both the history and also the future of what would be manned space flight or something tantamount to manned space flight. If you just look at the history of travel, one of the first things mastered was a very macroscopic type of process, wind. We developed sails which could capture wind that enabled man to master and transport himself across seas. At a certain point in that process, we then sort of went in a little deeper, and we gained control of things like mineable substances, like coal. Coal then, with a greater density of power and energy released to being burned, then enabled us to power things like locomotives, trains. That gave us an ability to then go beyond and start to conquer the continents. At a certain point, through the development of other types of chemicals now, molecular processes, we were able to refine things like oil and develop gases, fuels. These fuels then were able to allow us to fly to where we could get around the entire globe in a matter of a day or two. There was, again, a sort of going in, so to speak, beyond just the ore process to now we're looking at the mastery of chemical processes. At a certain point, that had a limit to it. And we sort of see the outer limit to that with what we were able to accomplish with Apollo. That we were, through the use of chemical rockets, then able to sort of reach really what is the feasible boundary of what man can do using simple chemical reactions. The next step is what we discovered and developed with nuclear processes. Now, many people may or may not be aware of this, but in the original development of the Apollo project, the intention was actually to develop nuclear rockets. That the use of chemical rockets was just an immediate requirement, but the idea was eventually to develop nuclear rockets, which would allow us not just to have a simple one shot to the moon. We'd have to detach, lose most of what was really the weight and substance of the spacecraft and float down to the moon, but to where you could develop reusable and guidable large crafts utilizing nuclear power. Now, in moving from chemical processes, such as what you have with combustion of gases and other fuels, to nuclear processes, we then made a transition. In a sense, we went further in. We went deeper into the substance of the universe. With that, largely came out of an understanding of the ability to control the splitting of the atom and the massive amounts of energy that were released as forecast and hypothesized by Einstein. Now, beyond that, and this is really now moving into the future, would be the development of fusion-powered rockets. Now, with fusion, you're moving beyond just a relatively simplistic understanding of what's happening at the atomic level, to where now you have to really understand what is a higher level of understanding of the structure, the curvature of the atom. That in order to get a fusion process, which is the bringing together of nuclei to form new substances that release orders of magnitude more energy than what you have with simple nuclear, you have to overcome things like what's known as the Coulomb barrier. In order to bring nuclei together, you have to overcome what is sort of the natural repulsive force that you find between like charges, like charged nuclei, to then get beyond a certain critical curvature to where now what were repulsive forces now actually become binding forces. And this is something which a former member of the Fusion Energy Foundation, someone who was at the core of the scientific movement that was behind the SDI project, Dr. Moon, was something that he was investigating and understanding the structure, the sort of the geometry, so to speak, of the nucleus, of thinking, is there a kind of least action way to get beyond what is now a very brute force method of trying to generate fusion? Is there a kind of least action way which taps into an understanding of what we might call the curvature of the physical space-time at that level to achieve fusion in a very producible and efficient way? Now, beyond fusion, and with fusion, we now have the ability to not just go to the moon, but now that would give us the ability to have real human flight to Mars. That with fusion, because of the energy density created relative to the weight of the apparatus and the fuel, you now would have the ability to take man and material to Mars, and to do it in a relatively short order of time, utilizing something we've discussed known as one-gravity acceleration, where you utilize the processes of fusion and the control and direction of the products of fusion to then create the thrust to move up to an acceleration, a constant acceleration equal to the acceleration we recognize here on Earth of standard Earth gravity. So one Earth gravity acceleration could theoretically get us to Mars in a matter of days. Now you might extend it a little bit, so you have to do a sort of reverse maneuver as you decelerate in, and there are other things to consider, but that's a very workable time frame to get to Mars in a matter of days, weeks, using 1g acceleration through a breakthrough in fusion. Beyond that is the next higher step, where now we're moving beyond just understanding processes that would allow fusion, but now moving to the domain of matter-antimatter reactions. This is effectively where you're bringing, and a lot of this gets complicated by just the language which is used in popular science now, but effectively you're bringing together matter which have opposite characteristics, opposite charge, what have you, that through their bringing together actually you get a perfect annihilation of matter transformed into energy. Now this represents several orders of magnitude of energy density, power density, beyond even what you have with fusion. Now, with matter-antimatter, not only does that now take us beyond the Mars limit, which really for fusion, Mars and maybe slightly beyond Mars is pretty much the outer limit of where mankind could go with fusion. With matter-antimatter, you have, in what's even being initially discussed as the potential, you have the ability to accelerate a spacecraft up to the outer limit of about 0.58 the speed of light, which would put us at the nearest star, Alpha Centauri, in a matter of 9 years. That we could actually move man into the vicinity of Alpha Centauri, the nearest star to our own star, the Sun, in a matter of 9 years. Now, obviously, there are all kinds of other considerations that go into that around the biological aspects of what that would require, and that opens up a whole other domain, which hopefully we will take up in some of the Q&A. But theoretically, in 9 years, through matter-antimatter reactions, we could be at not only a simple star either. Alpha Centauri is a binary star. So there's all kinds of other aspects of being able to either get there with human beings, whatever shielding would be required, but to investigate it, to get something there that could get into a new domain of our universe to understand more fundamentally how these processes work. Now, just to sort of go through a couple statistics to give you a sense of what we mean by this as we're going in, that's not really what's going on. From a simplistic standpoint, it seems as though we're sort of going in deeper and deeper in order to gain a power to go out further and further. This is why I say that, in fact, these scales of extension out and drawing in are actually bound by one single idea, are bound by one single concept, which is the concept of creative discovery of the human mind. That, in fact, what's happening as we probe deeper into the subatomic, it's not that we're just going deeper into spatial relationships. What's actually happening is that we're discovering greater degrees of freedom about the way that the universe is organized. We're discovering new principles that constitute the very structure of our universe. And it's that which then has the correlate that we discuss in economic terms as an increase in energy flux density. That each new discovery actually gives us an ability to bring more power to bear on a particular space-time location than would have otherwise been possible prior to the discovery of that new principle. And you see this just to throw out some, just to give you a sense of what this kind of increase of power means. A pound of coal, when burnt, gives you about 1 kilowatt hour of energy. A pound of gas, when burnt, gives you 6 kilowatts of power, 6 kilowatts an hour of energy. Deuterium, which would be at least the main fuel source for fusion that we would use here on Earth, gives you, in fact, 40 million kilowatts per hour of energy. And whenever we start to talk about matter-antimatter, and this is sort of a rough estimate, but assuming you get some sort of perfect annihilation and energy release, for 1 pound of matter-antimatter reaction, you get in the order of 1.1 billion kilowatts per hour of energy released. So you're moving from the burning of coal of 1 kilowatt an hour to potentially what you have with matter-antimatter, which is 1.1 billion. Now, there's some other complications that might reduce that in some ways, but I think you get the idea of the kind of scales that we're talking about and what kind of potentialities exist. One of the blocks now to that is that 1 gram of matter-antimatter production theoretically would cost, at this point, about $26 trillion. Now, that is not to say that matter-antimatter reactions are outside of our domain. That speaks nothing about the problem of matter-antimatter. What it actually speaks to is the problem of our current economy. It speaks to the problem of the current thinking of how we organize our economy and really the nature of the way that the population itself thinks. That could be reduced sort of in terms of the same scale of increase of power we get from matter-antimatter. Were we to move in that direction, you would actually have the same sort of inverse decline in the cost because of the new breakthroughs in organization of our physical economy that would ensue. This brings up a bigger problem. If we're going to go into this domain to get mastery at that level, at the subatomic level, it's going to require a fundamental revolution in science. that we will not progress to this next level unless we declare once and for all that empiricism is dead. Greenism is dead. It's got to go away. It's got to be eliminated like a cancer from our species. And that, in fact, we must now launch a full throttle revolution to say that what must become primary in our understanding of science, in our investigation of the universe, must be an understanding and investigation of the powers of free creative mind. That, in fact, mind and our understanding of mind must be that which takes precedent in our investigation of the physical universe. And let me get at why I say that. Things become very paradoxical whenever you get to the level of investigating the subatomic. And this is what comes up in what's now discussed as quantum physics. These paradoxes, unfortunately, have led those who have bastardized science, those who have acted on behalf of the British establishment, to declare that because of the paradoxes that come up, this domain is unknowable. We can't know what's happening at that level because we can't explain what's happening at that level in terms of simple sense-perceptive notions of space and time. And since man, being a beast, limited only to his biology, and therefore limited only to his ability to interpret sense impressions in a literal fashion, since the subatomic does not lend itself to a simple interpretation in terms of sense-based space and time measurement, well then therefore it's fundamentally unknowable. By doing that, they've declared science dead and have rendered mankind a virtually extinct species. They've declared man as a future extinct species. What I'd like to show is that, in fact, these very paradoxes that we find in the domain of the quantum can and must be resolved through an understanding of the characteristic of mind. A recognition that the universe itself is characteristically creative, and that the creative nature of this universe is in tune, in fact, with the willful creative nature of the human mind itself. So let's go to and look at a couple of different experiments that get at and show what some of these paradoxes are. The first thing we're going to look at is what's known as the double slit experiment that was conducted it was within the last decade or so at Hitachi Laboratories over in Japan by a U.S. physicist. And the experiment has been declared as perhaps the most beautiful experiment of the 20th century or the 21st century. Though the reason they give for its beauty is actually an evil one, but I think we can find real beauty in it. So what you're going to see here is you're going to see the effect of an experiment that was set up where you have two, the particle one, but not yet, where you have effectively an apparatus created where you've got two holes, and they're going to be shooting electrons in such a way that they get deflected towards either the left or the right slot. And then as they pass through either the left or the right, somewhat randomly determined, they're then going to impinge themselves on a screen behind that. Seems simple enough, and they're pretty certain that in fact they were able to capture one electron, however you want to understand an electron, shoot it through, and the next one would not actually move through one of the two holes until the previous one had hit the screen and been absorbed. And so, I'd like take a second to think, okay, if you have electrons, which we're supposed to believe are sort of little fundamental charged balls, shooting through one of two holes, what kind of effect would you expect to see on the screen? Is this not much different than if you were at a carnival and you had two holes in front of you and you're throwing baseballs through either one of them, that there'd be some sort of, on the screen that they are hitting, you'd get some sort of pattern that corresponded to that. Well, what actually is the effect that was registered through this kind of experiment? So let's take a look at the particle experiment here. So here you have a registering of these different particles as they go through these two holes and start to build up on the screen. And you see, obviously, there's some sort of a pattern emerging, which doesn't at all seem to correspond with what you would think would be the kind of emergent pattern if it was just simply particles shooting through one hole or the other. Now, we've seen this kind of pattern elsewhere, and we will go to a depiction of where this comes up in a phenomenon which we would expect it to come up in, which is in a simple wave interference pattern. Here you're going to see a depiction of two wave sources, which is basically the equivalent of the two holes, where you have, using a wave tank, using waves in water, where two waves are simultaneously moving towards an endpoint, towards a end screen. And so if we could just see that. Okay, so here you have a similar setup as the one I discussed with the electrons, but here you're dealing with waves in water. So you've got two sources producing waves, and you get the typical effect that you would surmise from simple geometry or just an understanding of this. You're getting an interference pattern, where the two waves are interfering in such a way that they either have constructive interference, where they amplify each other, or they cancel each other out, so that you get this alternating light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. A similar thing, and people may not be able to see this, but a similar thing happens whenever you shine a light source as a wave source through two small holes. You get a kind of interference pattern. And so, again, this is something, it makes sense. You could deduce that this would be the effect from an understanding of the relationship of waves. But whenever we again look at this, the particle buildup, you'll see that you get something very similar to that which you saw in this wave characteristic. That in fact, whenever we're using what we're told are particles, we get again a buildup of these kind of alternating light and dark interference patterns, which seems to be very contradictory to what most people would think should occur. Typically we think, well, little bullets going through two different holes should basically just form two patches on the other end. But instead you get what we're told are particles combining to produce a wave interference pattern. How does this happen? Supposedly, these are only single particles that are being shot through. So it seems as if as one particle hits the screen, it's somehow informing the next particle, hey buddy, you need to take this path in order to build up this particular pattern. There's no physical interference occurring, supposedly. The idea is that as only at the point that one of these electrons hits the screen does the next one come. So how, if you're just having a succession of events of this type, do you get this buildup of a kind of interference? How does one particle know what the previous one did? How does it communicate to the next one what it must do? It was out of these kinds of experiments that all sorts of weird concoctions were cooked up. That, well, what we're obviously seeing here is what we've come to know as the duality characteristic of phenomena, of light or of particles. That at the quantum level, things exist as both seemingly particle under certain kinds of experiments, like some of the experiments conducted by Einstein with the photoelectric effect, or coming out of Planck's discovery of the quanta, which seem to demonstrate a kind of particle view. But then other experiments, like this double slit experiment, seem to say, well, actually it has a wave-like characteristic, because you're getting interferences which are typical of wave-type activity. This then sort of sent the world spinning in a very bizarre way. Now, instead of saying, well, we've got something paradoxical here, this was taken to say, well, in fact, this is demonstrative of the fact that you really can't know what's happening at that level. And, of well, actually, if we can go to the video of the superfluid video, we'll see again another demonstration of a kind of process which demonstrates characteristics which have no representable notion in the simple ideas of space, time as derived from our general understanding of sense impressions of these things. So this is from an old video that was done with liquid helium. And so you got this helium. This is a tube. It's in a container which has very fine capillaries at its bottom. And these capillaries are so fine that the liquid can't pass through it under normal circumstances because of viscosity and friction among the particles. But when cooled down below a critical temperature, all of a sudden this fluid takes on completely new characteristics, and it starts to flow readily through this very small porous bottom. It takes on what's known as the superfluid characteristics. Now, it's said that what's occurring is that the fluid is losing all viscosity, that there's no internal friction to hold it there. And you see the demonstration here, it just passes right through the same substance, but now at a critical temperature passes through with zero viscosity. There's all kinds of discussions about what's behind that, and I'll get at some of the explanation that's used to explain this very paradoxical characteristic. Now, the next thing you're going to see here is a demonstration of effectively the elimination of entropy on the part of this fluid. That what you're seeing is the very dark bulb at the bottom has a hole in its bottom, and it's filled with very fine kind of powder. And this powder has again a very small spacing between it, super packed. So the spacing between it is as fine as the previous example with the holes in the bottom of the container. So they've now dipped this vessel with this powder packed into the bottom, but then with a hole underneath it, into super cold fluid. They're now heating the top. They're using a beam to heat the top of that black bulb, so it's actually warmer up towards the top than it is at the bottom. Now, typically, as we understand the domain of thermodynamics, right, we're told nothing ever flows from a colder to a warmer place. Right, it always flows in one direction. Heat always flows from a warmer to a colder place. But here what they demonstrate is that the very super cold fluid is flowing through that black bulb, which is being heated, and it's actually moving from a colder to a warmer spot, as you see demonstrated with the rising of the fluid in the flask here. So you have something which is occurring, which is overcoming our whole notion of entropy. Now you can just, if you want, you can cut that there. So again, the way some of this is discussed is that what's occurring to create this kind of superfluid condition is that it's discussed in terms of like superposition. That these molecules or these atoms are able to either, one, be in multiple states at the same time, meaning it can be in the same thing can have two different states of existence simultaneously, which that seems to be impossible from the reductionist standpoint. Or you're getting two different types of atoms which are occupying the same space, which again seems confounding, right? It's like saying that these two objects could somehow occupy the same space at the same time. Again, that seems to violate our understanding of the way that space and time operate. So a number of different ideas were spun out of this that said, okay, well, you've got things like superposition, things having more than one state of existence, or some two different things occupying the same position in space-time. That's completely not understandable. Or where the acting on something in one place in space-time seems to instantaneously determine the action or effect at some other place in space-time. That, if by acting on this, it instantaneously determines what could happen over here. Again, seems to completely violate our idea of the propagation of effects, action at a distance. This is what's discussed as non-local effects, non-locality. So, again, the conclusion was made. Yes, we see experimentally that things do act in this very ambiguous and paradoxical way. But since we can't explain it from the standpoint of simple sense-based ideas of space, time, motion, propagation, etc., well, then we must declare that, in fact, these things are unknowable. That really all we're left with is probabilities. That the wave characteristic that we see, for example, in the first experiment, really is because there's a probability wave, which isn't real, has no existence, but is a statistical probability that determines where the particle, the little hard ball, is going to hit. And that's as good as we can get. All we can have is statistics and probabilities about the likelihood that something is going to happen one way versus another way. And that whenever you, because of these probabilities, whenever you sort of act and determine one thing, it changes the probability of how something else is going to act. And that's how you're getting these non-local effects, because it's all based on, it's all tied into the probabilities. But these are unknowable. They're only fictions that we use, you know, with our limited minds and whatnot, we can use to have some at least control over what's around us. That thinking will never get us to Alpha Centauri. That thinking will never allow us to master the principles of matter, antimatter. And in fact, that kind of thinking will doom the human species. Is there another option? Well, in fact, there is. Where and in what domain do these kinds of paradoxical qualities become commonplace, so to speak? Do they become, in fact, characteristic of the domain? That is the domain of mind. And I'll give some examples just to sort of play around with this a little bit. If someone were to say to you in Shakespearean fashion that the key to a happy marriage is to lie with your wife, you might think, what couple different ways that we might think about what this word lie means. It might mean you need to lie about where was the last place that you lied. It may mean that you need to tell a lie in order to get a lie. Or it may mean both at the same time. Maybe the key to a happy marriage is both to lie with your wife and lie with your wife. That from the standpoint of irony, from the standpoint of metaphor, from the standpoint of the way that the mind communicates, all of these very funny characteristics that we find in the domain of the quantum become very real. They actually become necessary to the development and communicative potentials of mind. That the key to marriage is to lie with your wife can mean both things at the same time, or depending on how you understand it, it determines what it means. Now, to give another example of this, and I've used this one before, if I say, what is left when nothing goes right? That can mean a couple of different things. That could come out of, say, an investigation of the ideas of space and time. If, as I said in the beginning, that there is only one direction, there's only progress, well, then we say, okay, left and right, those are understood as opposite directions, to the left or to the right. But now if I'm investigating the idea that there's only one direction, let's say we eliminate right, well, does left have any meaning? What is left when nothing goes right? Okay. Or I might be sort of in the midst of some existentialist reveling, right? I've just lost my job, lost my home, and, you know, Obama's still in the White House, and saying, "Oy, what is left when nothing goes right?" Well, there again, left and right means something very different. What remains when nothing seems to operate in the proper fashion? So the same discussion, what is left when nothing goes right, depends on a couple of things. One, context. The context will give me an idea of which left and which right I mean. It also depends on directionality. If in saying what is left when nothing goes right, once I determine, say, in my mind upon hearing that left is directional, then the right that I speak must also be directional. If, on the other hand, I say, for me, left means remain, well, then the thing that makes more sense is right is proper. What is left when nothing good remains? What is left when nothing goes right? It works opposite, though, in the other direction in time. There are two different ways it functions in time. If I say what is left, and initially left could have, I'm sort of astute, and I'm thinking left could be directional, it could be remain. I'll let both possibilities exist simultaneously in my mind. When I get to right, depending on what I determine as the notion of right, that's going to determine retrospectively which left it is. If I say what goes left when nothing, or what is left when nothing goes right, as soon as I say right means direction, instantaneously, simultaneously with that determination, this one now becomes directional. If I think of left as what remains, all of a sudden, retrospectively, this one becomes determinational. But it has this property, which is discussed in quantum physics, that it's non-commutative. It actually flows differently in one direction than it flows in the other direction. Something which, again, contradicts some of the main problems that you find in things like thermodynamics, which actually state that both possibilities, left and right, are actually indistinguishable. So we see that in mind, when we go into the domain of the way that the mind works, the way that human communication works, many of these paradoxical characteristics that we find in the domain of the quantum actually become readily accessible. Now, lest you think these were just some parlor tricks, as Pete brought up, it was actually this quality of mind, this idea of thinking in terms of irony, thinking in terms of metaphor, which has been at the core of all advances in science. The most typical one is what was brought up with Johannes Kepler, of counterposing in looking at the solar system, one object, having to counterpose both the notion of what seemed to be a harmonic ordering of the planets according to a vision-based geometry, the nesting of the Platonic solids, versus then another notion which came to him as a harmonic ordering according to a sound-based harmonics, a time-based conception. So you've got vision and hearing, space and time, both of which are being counterposed against each other as a metaphorical counterpoint to lead you to what must be really the higher idea which subsumes the entire thing, which is neither sight nor sound, space nor time, but which is something which is characteristically of mind. And in fact, it was this understanding which led someone like Köhler, the founder of Gestalt psychology, to state something that he got from someone he studied under, Max Planck, who said to Köhler that he believed that many of the discoveries and the resolution to a number of the paradoxes that Planck was encountering in the domain of quantum physics would be resolved by the kind of method being employed by Köhler into the investigation of mind. That among the greats, Einstein, Planck, they recognized that the domain of mind is the most ontologically superior and efficient principle in the universe. That whether you're looking at the very small, the very large, whatever, it's mind which is pervasive. It's the creative principle of mind which characterizes and bounds the universe. And that the only way that we're going to be able to understand and gain necessary and efficient mastery of this universe is to the extent we incorporate our investigation of mind as what becomes the dominant principle by which we investigate the universe as a whole. That becomes a problem right now whenever we're now led by a president who himself has lost his mind. So if the universe is characteristically of mind, it doesn't make a lot of sense to be led by someone who themselves has lost their mind. And so I'll just leave it at that, and I guess we'll open up for questions, or Matt will come up here.
Good. Thank you very much, Cody. Thank you very much, Peter. If you're just tuning in right now, you're watching a live webcast from LaRouchepack.com featuring two presentations that were made by two members of the LaRouchePack scientific basement research team. We do have live audiences gathered all across the United States in several major cities. We also have people watching internationally. And I would like to actually start with some of the questions that we've received from foreign countries. I'd like to start by actually grouping two questions together that have come in from people watching from two separate locations in Ireland. The first one is on the question of pagan environmentalism, as we've called it. The questioner says, "Hello, Peter and Cody. Joe Caulfield here from turn180.ie, a website dedicated to refuting global warming, based in Ireland." He says, "Good luck with impeaching Obama. We here are desperately trying to protect our individual and economic liberties from the Green EU agenda. The good news is we believe the tide is turning as more and more people are waking up and stepping forward. Let us know how we can help you get the American people to see Obama's contempt for them and his totalitarian ambitions. Cheers, Joe." So that's the first question. The second one comes in from Gene Douglas, who is writing to us from Northern Ireland. He says, "Hello, Cody and Peter. Warmest greetings from your friends in Ireland. Today in Ireland, we are fortunate to be the ones who stand on the verge of realizing those Republican ideals that many generations of Irish men and women have fought for. The British have planned our annihilation for hundreds of years, and yet we're still here, while their empire is going down. Whilst working very hard to stop the little goblin queen and her consort's plans for World War III, the LaRouche Irish Science Team, LIST for short, produced a paper in late October outlining certain specific proposals for the science-driven economic development of our country within the new political alignment now taking shape, led by Russia and China, and soon to be joined by a post-Obama United States. One key proposal is for the development of a deep water superport on the Shannon estuary to facilitate shipping via the northern sea route across the Arctic. This would give us an active role in the vast project to develop Siberia and the wider Arctic region." He continues by saying, "Amongst the other proposals outlined in our paper are some related to the exploration of the Atlantic deep ocean, not only for minerals and other such resources, but in terms of astrobiology. Recent discoveries in this field, where previously unknown life forms have been discovered inhabiting extremely hostile environments, have prompted a NASA representative to declare," this is a quote, "the definition of life has just expanded. As we pursue our efforts to seek signs of life in the solar system, we have to think more broadly, more diversely, and consider life as we do not know it." So Gene says, "In this light, I was wondering how you see these new discoveries in astrobiology informing our exploration of space, and in the longer term, possibly even the terraforming of other planets in the solar system and beyond. And what sort of time frame would you envisage for such terraforming projects? Thanks, Gene."
All right, I'll take the second part first on subject of life in the universe. First of all, actually, I'll take the first part first. As I said, green fascism is a horrid British religion right now that should also be put into a museum so that we can take our kids there at some point in the future, to scare them and things like that, of what past human life looked like on the earth. What were some of the plagues that plagued us? I'd say one of these guys want to reduce the emission of carbon dioxide on the earth, but one of the most dangerous emissions of carbon dioxide is the travel of Tony Blair's airplane anywhere on the planet right now. Environmentalism it's completely retarded. because it not only misses what human cognitive life is. It's a religious belief that human cognitive life doesn't exist, but it actually misunderstands what life is in general. And this gets at the second issue of astrobiology. Mr. LaRouche wrote a recent paper, which is going to be coming out today, which addresses this question of, it's an important question, what is life? Right now, the definition of life that you get anywhere, and I think that the NASA astrobiology program actually has a definition of what they consider life as part of their program so that they have some bounds for what they're looking at. But the definition of life right now it's a completely reductionist view, which essentially reduces life to a very lucky expression of abiotic chemistry instead of what life is. So the question is, okay, what is life? On the surface of the Earth, we have an expression of life. We have varied expressions of life. You can look at the biosphere of the Earth as the predominant expression of life as it expresses itself on the Earth. That's on the surface of the Earth, within the Earth. At this point, we don't know how deep life goes into the Earth. We found life down to approximately 12 kilometers in solid rock. So we don't know how deep life goes. We've found bacteria up in the highest reaches of our atmosphere. We don't know how high life goes. But we know that there is a predominant expression of life on the Earth. Carbon-based. It absolutely depends on carbon dioxide. Even organisms on the Earth that don't depend on oxygen depend on carbon dioxide in order to form their makeup. DNA, for example, requires the carbon that comes from carbon dioxide. So life on the Earth has its own particular expression. The question that Lynn and LaRouche raises in his new paper, which I'd recommend you read, is what is life such that it's capable of being expressed in the universe, with the Earth being a special case of the expression of that life. Perhaps, and he kind of has some fun with this, that perhaps in some other system in the universe, perhaps in another galaxy in the universe, there was the development of a biosphere somewhere else in this other galaxy. Perhaps that development of life led to a development of cognitive life, which the first assertion that Lynn and LaRouche makes is that by definition, if it's cognitive, if it has a mind, the state of their development might be far advanced from us, but it would be comprehensible and we would be able to communicate back and forth. They would be expressing what is expressed by human beings as the mind. The point being that the universe contains an expression of cognition and contains an expression of life. Perhaps life is possible everywhere in the universe. Perhaps cognitive life is possible everywhere in the universe, which probably means that we should try to get out into the rest of the universe to check it out. But the question that you run into is, okay, well, what is life? And this gets at the issue of not just astrobiology. The astrobiology program is interesting because they're searching out areas on the Earth which are traditionally considered as being devoid of life because they're so harsh. But we find communities of organisms thriving inside of volcanoes, on the driest areas of the Earth, like the Atacama Desert down in Argentina, at the bottoms of some of these ocean trenches, which are the deepest places on the planet and some of the coldest places. We found life deep in the ice in Antarctica, inside of the solid ice, bacteria, and shrimp. So the astrobiology program is good because it's an attempt to stretch the bounds of where life is possible on the Earth. And all the indications are that we have areas on the Earth which are similar in physical composition as you have on Mars. So possibly, especially since we've found water on Mars, we'll find life on Mars. But the issue becomes, we have to get out into space. We have to get our species out into space. We need people to go to the moon. We need people to go to Mars. We need people to go to Titan, the moon of Saturn, which looks like Strangely enough, it's one of the most Earth-like bodies in our solar system, even though it's orbiting Saturn. It's raining there right now, for example. Maybe some people in the Midwest here are getting some of the effects of precipitation. But we need to get humans into space so that we can go to these places which look physically similar to the Earth, or identifiable according to an Earth, the knowledge that we've accumulated by studies of the Earth. What we'll find are conditions that are actually different, possibly expressing principles that we do not know exist yet. And under those new conditions that we discover, we may find an expression of life that's completely distinct from anything that you could find on the Earth. Completely different biochemistries, completely different modes of development of evolution of those creatures. So the question of terraforming is not simply let's take lichens from Siberia and drop them on the deserts of Mars, or let's figure out a way to increase the amount of oxygen or carbon dioxide on Mars. It's likely that that's a good idea to do, but what we need to do is figure out what is the universal principle of life. What we know so far is a special case of life. We know some of the limits of this special case, but we don't know what's necessary for life off of our planet. So in order to, and the study of life is actually extremely young. The real breakthroughs in life were made within the past 200 years by people like Pasteur, people like Vladimir Vernadsky, who discovered that the universe not just contains life, but that life exists within a different type of space-time, a different type of geometry, a different type of condition of space-time than the abiotic. In order to recognize what are the needed principles for the expression of life, we have to go out into space and try to terraform. Maybe we'll find places that are formed for life, but are completely different conditions than the Earth within our own solar system. So, that's what I'd say on that. I don't know if you want to add something.
No, I would just say, just a little add-on to that, it just shows the tragedy of what environmentalism has done in destroying real science. When you look at the failure, because of the backwards nature of where science has been going, in what Pete had mentioned earlier in his presentation around the Phobos Grunt mission, where on this mission there was a couple little cute water bears, which are these very small microorganisms, which were on this thing, which were intended to be taken up into and around Phobos and come back to investigate, what effects does going that distance, what effects does going into a different electromagnetic environment, a different cosmic ray environment, have on even the most simple forms of life. The fact that that mission failed is not so much a reflection on the intention or desires of the Russian space program, but it's much more a reflection of what had been, as Matt had brought up, 30-plus years of an attack on what could have been a U.S.-Russian collaboration to push the boundaries of space and other scientific exploration. So it just sort of punctuates the tragedy that we've been living through for at least 30 years, if not going back further to really the death of Roosevelt.
Oh, and actually, I'll just add in terms of what can Ireland do to help us in the United States, this report that the Irish gentleman discussed of how do you develop Ireland in order to be one of the keystone nations in the development of the Arctic, that kind of concept, we need more of that.
Good, thank you. This question comes in from France, from Bertrand Busson, who is currently watching from Paris. He says, "Hi, I'm Bertrand from Paris, France. As you said earlier, last October, Russian ambassador to NATO, Dmitry Rogozin, son of a distinguished Soviet military historian, put out a proposal for the strategic defense of Earth, seemingly in the spirit of LaRouche's late 1970s SDI project, but with dual use of protecting the Earth against asteroids and that type of threat. My question is this: do you know more about the science of the system implied? And number two, for what reason has modern society never discussed this issue before? whereas without warning, an asteroid could blow out mankind in a single shot at any time.
All right, so the strategic defense of the Earth. This is essentially a repeat of Lyndon LaRouche's concept of the Strategic Defense Initiative, which is, in a nutshell, it's developing our space environment. By space, we're not talking empty space. We mean changing the composition of the environment surrounding the Earth so that we can protect, the human population from nuclear war. So, for example, you put weaponry in space to be able to shoot down nuclear missiles before they become operational. So they're launched, and in mid-flight towards their target, these spacecraft could, you shoot a very tiny hole into the nose cone of these rockets, and you can deactivate the nuclear weapon inside. And it's much more efficient to do that than try to shoot the intercontinental ballistic missile with another intercontinental ballistic missile or something like that, which is this current program of the anti-ballistic missile defense, which is totally stupid and totally low tech. There may be applications of science within it, but at its foundation, it's a crazy concept. The Strategic Defense Initiative was, in LaRouche's eyes, the forefront of technology. In order to defend ourselves from a nuclear war, you have to push the boundaries of what we know in science. So, for example, shooting a laser from space into the Earth, you have to be very conscious of what frequencies you use, because our atmosphere is not transparent to certain frequencies of radiation. So it's pushing the boundaries of what we know about radiation, about transfer, about the production of various types of what you would consider beam weaponry. But this would lead into the investigations of what the interaction is between radiations, which we'll be able to develop more and more conscious control over, and the relationship to life and medicine and things like that. Now, the strategic Earth defense was a flank, a big flank. Because first of all, it represents the fact that the Russians are readopting LaRouche's Strategic Defense Initiative, which under Gorbachev, under first Andropov, and then under Gorbachev, who are both British operatives within Russia, who refused the cooperation that LaRouche was offering them on this project, which would have saved Russia. They said no, but now the Russians are saying, oh, the current government says yes. But we're going to add to it the concept that we have a mission to save civilization from space also. So you had this recent event which shined a bright light on what the importance of this is, with this asteroid that passed between the Earth and the Moon, which we just found out about just recently. It's the closest object we know of that's passed the Earth. We may have missed a couple of these near-Earth objects within the recent period. There are a lot of these objects that could be passing near the Earth. If this one had changed course by just, a centimeter several years ago, it would have probably hit the Earth and wiped out a large section of the population on the Earth. This is the kind of thing we got to be prepared for occurring. Now, how do you deal with that? First, you have to have the ability to detect these things, which means you can't shut down your space-based operations. You need to accelerate the production of things like robotic, automated probes to watch the solar system, which is what the Russians are calling for. It means you need to have instrumentation that watches the surface of the Earth constantly to perhaps forecast earthquake events and things of that nature. If you detect an asteroid that's hurtling towards the Earth, you got to have a way to redirect it or do something about it. If you can catch it early on, you can redirect it through, pushing it, or you could blow the thing up with our thermonuclear weapons, right? A real peaceful use of thermonuclear weapons, what they're actually intended for. There are various ways that you can deal with it, but the key is you need early detection, and this gets at the point. The way man avoids extinction is through being is through enabling an ability to forecast, which means you have to have the right types of technology and sensing equipment, but you also have to have a sense of increasing our power over knowledge in the solar system and the rest of the universe. So what we can forecast, we can act on. If we don't know we're going to get hit by something, we're going to get hit by it. So I think that's in a nutshell what the intent was of the Strategic Defense Initiative and now the new Strategic Earth Defense. But again, it was a really big flank by the Russian government to do this because it really pissed off Obama, and it really pisses off the British.
Okay, thank you. Now, coming back to the United States, we actually have a question which has come in from Rachel Brown, who, as people watching may know, is a member of the National LaRouche Democratic slate of candidates, and she ran a very successful campaign in the past election cycle in which she led the fight to impeach Obama, to reinstate Glass-Steagall, and engaged in a very historic debate, televised debate, with none other than Barney Frank. Now, Rachel asks a rather lengthy question, but I'd like to read the whole thing because I think it's important. She says, "Greetings, Cody and Peter. Here's a couple of questions. I mainly wanted to see if you have anything to throw out about the other galaxies having different space-times question, and also the recent discussion of a field of life existing throughout the entire universe, and how the cognitive species omnipervasiveness related to it, which is just really exciting," she says. "The idea of a living space might help to look at the more seemingly foreign idea of the field of another galaxy, since we can define its properties." She says, "If the fine structure constant isn't constant, what does this say about other possible physical spacetimes in other galaxies? We have certain relationships of gravity, electromagnetism, chemical properties, etc. in our local Milky Way conditions, but how could these act differently maybe in other galaxies? The recent discovery of complex organic compounds being produced by stars in space, which compounds were formerly known to be associated primarily with life, also points to the question maybe of a field of life or living space throughout the universe." Then she asks, "How might this principle of life manifest itself differently in other galaxies, or what insight might we gain about life on Earth if other forms of life exist under different conditions?"
All right, well, not your standard question from a congressional candidate, I can assure you. But, yeah, I'll do my best to tackle the various aspects of it. In regards to this idea of the pervasiveness of life in the universe, that what we have to start to move to is an understanding that, in fact, life is not a thing. Life is not an object. There are not living things in an otherwise abiotic or dead universe. But in fact, what we see as living things are an expression, a discrete expression of a principle which is pervasive in the universe. Now, just to get at that maybe from one of the things you brought up, it is the case that in the recent period, they have located what are considered as organic molecules, or the precursors of organic molecules, at the edges of some of these stellar nebula, things like complex carbon structures. Now, the typical analysis of this, which is the way it's often spun by your British empiricist scientist, is to say, well, look, here we see, since these are precursors of life and could eventually become living organisms, that clearly we have a demonstration that life, or what we think of as life, can come from a non-living process. Because as we know, a star is nothing more than some hot gas interacting in some kinematic way and producing heat and governed by the laws of thermodynamics. And so since that non-living process seems to be producing what we typically think of as living elements, Well, we've perhaps have some proof or some idea of how life could come from a non-living process. And that, in fact, maybe this explains how life started on Earth. That some of these materials, these organic materials, were transported from a far distant place onto Earth, and because of the ideal conditions on Earth, took hold and sprung up. We would contend the opposite. And in fact, if you look at the history of life on Earth, and you understand life not as a thing, but ask a different question. Not what is life, but better what Vernadsky looked at, which is what does life do? What are the effects and actions which are characteristically living? Then you can start to think about how do you determine a living process. You determine it not from what is its chemical makeup, but you determine it from what does it do? Does it produce effects which are coherent with what we think of as living effects? Is it part of what we consider as a directional evolutionary development process? As we look at the history of life on our planet, it has gone from very small, simple-celled organisms to developing more complex systems, which then eventually moved out of the seas onto the land. In the process, developed a capability to change its interaction with the cosmic medium by producing an atmosphere and producing an ozone layer. That life then evolved to then higher forms, which express themselves in a greater ability to both reproduce, but a greater ability to affect change on the planet, to become more organized and more structured. And that we've seen this long arc of evolutionary development on the planet has been one characterized by what we would consider as an anti-entropic process. It's constantly in a process. Life as a whole on the planet, the biosphere, is always developing towards greater complexity, greater energy throughput, and a greater power to affect change and transformation on the planet. So life is characterized by what it does, this characteristic of anti-entropic development. So whenever we look and say, wow, there are what seem to be organic materials developing around a star, maybe in fact what that's more indicative of is that stellar processes are not abiotic processes, but are in fact a different expression of a anti-entropic living type of process. That why should we necessarily say that because our assumption about the nature of a star, about the chemical buildup of a star, must we necessarily say that's a non-living process? The fact that we see molecular formations is perhaps indicative of the fact that you've got a broader scope of what we must consider as a living process, a living effect. And this is something which again expresses itself in what's coming forward as potentially evidence that the fine structure constant is in fact not constant. That there's some research that's been done, and we're investigating to see, how valid is it. And we have a lot of reason to believe that if this particular research isn't valid, the concept, the principle is valid. That they found along a certain pole, a dipole of our of our universe, that you find when you look in one direction of the pole, the fine structure constant, which is really a composition of a number of other constants, the relationship between the fundamental electric charge, the speed of light, and Planck's constant, that the fine structure constant seems to be increasing. The number which represents it in one direction seems to be increasing as you go further out, whereas in the other direction it seems to be decreasing as you go further out. One, there's a problem in how they determine the idea of going further out. It's based off of this idea of redshift, which we'll get into later, but the fact that it's redshifted does not necessarily mean a change in distance. It may just mean a change in the overall curvature of the space-time in that location. What really you could better say is that in these two opposite directions, a change in redshift corresponds with a change in the fine structure constant, which one indicates that this thing is not a constant, which is, it's good to know that we don't live in a fixed universe governed by constants. But it also poses other funny questions. That it's often said that the relationship, which is typified by the fine structure constant, is what enables life and the molecules and the chemistry that we know here on Earth to exist. That were the fine structure constant different, life, the chemical processes we know here, could not occur. And so we sort of live in this very sweet spot of the universe where everything seems to work out perfectly to produce the life and that which we are very familiar with. Now, the fact that it may be different in other parts of the universe doesn't mean that life can't exist there. All it might necessarily mean is that life, as a pervasive principle in the universe, will express itself differently in other places in the universe. That the chemical composition of life might be very different. That because of the various characteristics of the relationships of different principles, of say even the relationship of electricity and magnetism, being different in other parts of the universe, are going to mean that the material that life would grab hold of, there might be different material which is more appropriate to life grabbing hold of it and expressing itself. That the way life expresses itself on Earth may be just the most efficient means through which life can express itself relative to our chemistry and our organization of things on Earth. But if that organization, if that curvature, so to speak, of space-time and the principal relationships in it are different in other parts of the universe, then life, as well as cognition, may find a more efficient and more appropriate means through which to express their manifestation. And so this is the kind of investigation that we really need to push the boundaries on right now. And obviously, being stuck here on Earth, we have a certain limit. The more we can get off of Earth and send instrumentation, the more we can find out about what's really going on out there. And in doing so, we'll also find out more about what's really going on here. And so that's what I would just say, I would put forward as, you know, in the best way possible, in the shortest time possible, to get at some of these paradoxes that you're putting out there and kind of giving a sense of the kind of ontological approach that we need to have to answering these very provocative questions.
And I'll just amplify that. Vernadsky and Pasteur, his predecessor, were pretty clear that life was a different type of phenomena than that abiotic. And both of them, Vernadsky latched onto Pasteur's work on the optical biophysics, which is that life is extremely sensitive to all types of radiation that we know of. And Vernadsky kind of broadened that to all the domains of radiation, and saw that, for example, photosynthesis, life on the Earth, which is the root of life on the surface of the Earth, it starts with photosynthesis. This is where cosmic radiation is transformed into biological action on the surface of the Earth. Life transforms the surface of the Earth using cosmic radiation. It's a very close interaction. So on the one hand, you could ask the question, okay, well, is life a form of cosmic radiation that's acting as a wave particle type existence? But the other part of it is that life is very, very sensitive to radiations. There's now Pasteur's work was on the response of organisms to polarized light. That organisms have the capability of producing, in his experiments, solutions that would rotate the plane of polarization of light, which is very strange. There are various problems with that, like usually you need a crystal form to rotate the polarization of light. You can explain that in terms of the crystal structure, but in a liquid, which is supposedly a random conglomeration of moving molecules, how do you polarize light? Life can select the direction of polarization of light. There are also other experiments coming out now on chlorophyll. That chlorophyll is selectively sensitive to one direction of circularly polarized light and less sensitive to the other direction of circularly polarized light. Very interesting. You can't see circularly polarized light, but yet, at the very least, chlorophyll and some organisms can respond to circularly polarized light. So there's a very close relationship. The other thing you find in chlorophyll is that, and the photosynthetic apparatus, is that chlorophyll, and this is just a key example. Chlorophyll in the abiotic, when you separate chlorophyll from the photosynthetic apparatus, it's sensitive to very specific bands of radiation, typically a red band and a blue band. But when it's inside of a living organism, the band of radiation that it becomes sensitive to is shifted typically towards the red. And it's different depending on what type of organism you look at. Even though it's the same chlorophyll, you can take all these, this selection of different organisms, separate out the chlorophyll from each of them, put it in a solution of alcohol, and each one will be sensitive to the same band of radiation. But when it's in those particular organisms, each organism has shifted the band of radiation that it's sensitive to. It's red shifted it. Now, you can try to explain this in terms of how the particles are arranged inside the creatures, but I would go back to Vernadsky's concept that what you're looking at in life it's a form of space-time that is most appropriately described in terms of Einstein's concept of general relativity, that it's a different shape of space-time. From that standpoint, you look at redshift a little bit differently. Perhaps it's a relativistic redshift. Now, when you look at these galaxies that are redshifted or have various things like the fine structure constant is different in a different galaxy, which changes depending on the redshift, perhaps what you're looking at is a different phase space inside that other galaxy in the same way that you have a different phase space inside of life on the Earth. So one thing that comes up is we should be experimenting on the Earth with changing these various constants, the speed of light, the curvature of spacetime. Can you change pi, the value of pi? Can you change the fine structure constant within a laboratory inside of living organisms? In that way, man will be experimenting with changing the structure of spacetime and coming to understand what this field of life is that you mentioned, Rachel. So,
I think in the context of just what you've discussed in the answer to Rachel's question, here's two questions which both address relativity from slightly different perspectives, but I'd like to ask both of them together. The first is from Alan Demers, who's currently watching in Boston, Massachusetts. He says, "Dear Basement, today the internet is full of stories of a successful repeat of the September experiment that seemed to suggest that neutrinos could travel faster than light. These stories are usually accompanied by the bold assertion that this experiment refutes Einstein's theory of relativity. Are you familiar with these experiments, and what is the significance of them?" And then I'd also like to ask a question which has come in from Argentina, from Betiana Gonzalez. And she quotes a small passage from Lyndon LaRouche's most recent report. I'll read the passage she quoted. She says, this is from LaRouche's paper, "The principle of physical economy leads to and requires a rejection of a Laplacian notion of time. In any competent practice of the branch of physical science known as physical economy, time is measured across a displacement of action in the passage of physical time. It is a qualitative change in action which measures the time during which a principled change in relative power of economic action is to be measured, either forward or when a decline of the physically principled degree of action is to be measured has occurred. This is the physical notion of economic time." And Betiana asks, could you say more about LaRouche's notion of economic time?
Yeah, I'll take this one on. Maybe Cody has something to say afterwards. But for the speed of light, according to these experiments, is not the universal speed limit of the universe. And I think that it's a fallacy that's coming out of, what we're dealing with right now is a science that's polluted by the British, predominantly the British. But it's the general oligarchical problem. You get your scientists, especially if they're studying something fundamental, like you get at these particle accelerators at CERN, Fermilab, and so forth, where you're sure that they're going to run into phenomena that display principles that we don't know exist yet. They're going to run into phenomena that are not explainable according to what we know now. You want to get those scientists in particular to become religious adherents to Newtonian reductionism. All right, and that's what's displayed in a lot of the attempts to explain away this phenomenon. They discovered neutrinos, which might not really exist as fundamental entities in the universe, but they discovered that these neutrinos can move faster than the speed of light if you project them through the Earth a very long distance. And the first response to this was, well, those French just don't know how to do their experiments with CERN. You know, they have experimental error, and that's what they're reading. But then it was repeated several times, like the recent one that you're bringing up, Alan. Now the question is, okay, one, can we explain this in terms of regular Newtonian physics? Two, can we explain this in terms of the mathematics that was developed in order to be the background of Einstein's relativity? And three, was Einstein wrong? Because Einstein said that the speed of light is the absolute limit, right? Let's step back, because this is an oligarchical trick. Einstein, yes, one of his postulates was that, let's say that the speed of light is a constant speed. And some of the result of the mathematics that comes out of it is that the speed of light is the limit. That wasn't the core of what Einstein did. Einstein died early. He died an old man, but he died without finishing the work that he was working on, which is typical of a great scientist. Einstein was in a very hostile environment. He had very few friends because, in particular, Bertrand Russell decided that Einstein was public enemy number one. And then the British animal Hitler declared Einstein public enemy number one also. He was in a hostile environment. The Solvay conferences were a hostile environment. The whole Bohr-Heisenberg apparatus was an attack operation against what Einstein was developing. Because Einstein's his mission was not to declare that there's some fixed speed in the universe, that there's some fixed speed limit. He was out to challenge the existence of the concept of absolute space and the concept of absolute time, that you can measure everything in the universe on a linear timeline. His work challenged that. It's the most successful challenge that we've seen in the 20th century up until the recent period from the work of Lyndon LaRouche and what we're doing in the basement. It's the most significant challenge to the concept of absolute time since it was established as a British doctrine back during the time of Newton. So what Einstein was really provoking was a revolution in knowledge of what is physical space-time. And then that's what gets at the other issue, time. What is time? The typical concept of time is that you have a clock somewhere. God has a clock, and his clock is always right. Your clock is always wrong, but you're always trying to approximate that one clock, right? God's clock is the best because he's God, and that thing is going to be ticking away, and God can't change that. But you can improve your clocks. And so everything in the universe marches along in this procession of time, which had a beginning at some point, and it's going to have an end at some point. But we're marching along in a linear fashion. Sometimes you move faster, sometimes you move slower, but there's a linear timeline. Any study of classical artistic composition, particularly in music, in the composition of music, and in the honest enjoyment of real music, or in the experience of classical drama, or any type of classical art, you see immediately or in the honest investigation of how scientific discoveries get produced, you see pretty quickly that if you're honest about it, time is not linear. You have a constant back and forth of time. Constantly, when you're listening to a piece of music, the previous music is catching up with the present, and the question of what's going to happen next acts on that expression of the past acting into the future. There's a constant back and forth. When you're working on any actual scientific idea, your mind is constantly going back. What's the earlier hypothesis? How does that inform what the next hypothesis is going to be? How was I wrong before? How is this going to change what I do next? Every real cognitive act works in terms of this, what Lynn and LaRouche has called time reversal. It's not that time flows backwards, or you do some kind of space travel or time travel or something like that. But it's that time is not a linear measurement. Now, what you get with some of these phenomena, like objects apparently moving faster than light, or different redshifts in other galaxies, or what appear to be different spacetimes, you can mark off what appears to be a progression of events onto a timeline. All right, that's fine. You can measure events on a timeline. It's in the same way that you can measure the height of your child, right? People have kids these days. We would wish that they'd have more kids. All right, we need a lot more kids. But when you have a kid, you're excited about watching the growth of your child. So you mark off how tall that kid is depending on how old he is. What you're measuring is not the substance of that kid. All right? You're projecting some aspect of that child onto your wall and then measuring how long that mark is. That is not your child. That is something that represents something about your child, but that's not your child. In the same way that events that can be laid out onto a timeline, that is not time. That's a projection of a principle onto some type of a linear measurement, which is inherently a sense-perceptual measurement that does not reflect accurately what you're dealing with. There's something being reflected, but it's not reflected completely. So the issue of real time is you have to look at how human cognition works, and then recognize that the rest of the universe expresses the human creative act, because we were created in the image of the driver of this whole universe. So things like redshift you would have to expect exist as a projection of possibly a different progression of time in a different place in the universe. Perhaps time functions in a different way depending on where you are in the universe. It's a projection of a different space-time onto our sense-perceptual domain inside of our own universe, which has its own principles of space-time. So that's how I'd answer that.
Well, I'll just add something that gets at it is people are familiar with St. Augustine, who in his book on the Confessions takes up this problem of time. And he takes on this funny thing. He says there are people who ask the question, what was God doing before he created the universe? And sort of the assumption of that is that there's something called time or space that must have existed in which God is acting to create the universe. And he makes the point that this is a complete fallacy of composition, this question, that there is no before God created the universe, that there is no place in which God is acting to create the universe. That in fact what we think of as time is itself a reflection, is generated by creation. That were there no creation, were there no creativity, there would be no such thing that we would measure or project as time. And the same thing with space. So that what's ontologically primary is the act of creation, the creative process. Now, since creativity and creation is inherently, by its nature, a non-static quality, right? It's not just there's a created universe, there's a creative universe, of which man plays a very fundamental and integral role in pushing forward. So when you look at this idea of time, you have to recognize that time is a function of relative rates of creativity, relative rates of creation. That when you find different expressions of time, or what seem to express themselves as different rates of time, different changes of time, that in fact what you're looking at is you're looking at relative relationships of different creative processes, creative action. That it's the characteristics of action which are projecting themselves as different qualities of time. That in fact this is really what Einstein was getting at. I mean, the core idea that Lyndon LaRouche always hits on when referencing Einstein, the idea of a conception of a universe as finite but unbounded. Meaning that you have a universe which is finite in the sense that it's knowable, not finite in spatial extent, but finite in the sense that it's knowable. It's bound by principles. It's not just an arbitrary blah. It's bound by principles and knowable. But so it's finite, but in a sense unbound, in the sense that it's constantly undergoing a creative process. It's constantly susceptible to creative lawful change. And that this is really what was at the core of Einstein's discovery and Einstein's thinking. That his challenge that came out in relativity was not, as Peter said, is not an attempt to find a fixed speed limit. Say, what is the speed limit of the universe? But rather to challenge the notions that there's any kind of ontological primacy to space or time. To say that what we measure as space and time are relative. They change as a function of what's the creative process that's operating. If you're measuring it against something like radiation, light, which itself we can think of as an expression of some creative act, it's sort of the radiation of a creative action, well then space and time are going to change relative to that radiant effect. And it's very much in line with with Einstein being a devotee of Kepler, that neither space as maybe a visual based sensation nor time as a auditory based sensation are ontologically primary. That what's primary is not the senses but mind, creativity, and creation. And so that's what I would say to start to address that. And the attacks on Einstein are really an attack on that idea, an attack on the creative principle, not so much, someone found, wow, light seems to be going a hair of a second faster here. Isn't everything Einstein did wrong now? No, that's completely insane.
Okay, we're coming to the end of the amount of time that we have allocated for this webcast. I'd like to ask one last question, which I think probably everybody watching will find useful. This question is coming in from Holland, and it says, "Hello, greetings from the Free Dutch. Congratulations, this webcast is a historic breakthrough and will be reviewed millions of times by people around the world. Here is our question. It is obvious that important knowledge is not being taught today at schools and universities. Can you provide us some guidance as to where to find a curriculum that we can study so that we can contribute more efficiently to this fight for the survival of humanity?"
Are we cutting it forth there? Okay. Well, I would just say very simply, you can locate it in the work that we've been doing and presenting on our website, I think would be the obvious one. That the challenge is to take up the historical investigation of looking at the fact that there has been, going back to the very beginning, there has been this fight between the oligarchical, the Zeusian principle, and the Promethean principle. And that education of late, and really it's been dominated by this oligarchical idea, which has been to destroy man's ability to think creatively. That science has been replaced with empiricism, in place with deductive logic. Creativity has been eliminated by imposing on the mind the idea that knowledge only exists to the extent that you can represent it in some logical mathematical form, or that you can express it in terms which are susceptible to sense impressions. There's been a completely different, and that's the Newtonian current, That's the current of Bohr, Heisenberg, and others that we now find in quantum physics. There's been a completely contrary current, which is one that goes back to the Platonic tradition. It goes back to the mythical idea of Prometheus. It's the tradition which says that mind is what's ontologically primary, that we live in a creative universe, and that man is the expression of that creative process, that the universe exists in such a way that it's susceptible to being known and acted on by man to further the governing intention of that creative universe. And that if you look at, I mean, you can go through the sort of the litany, but the arc we've taken, what we once called the narrow path, was one it took us up through from Plato into certain people around the Renaissance, like Cusa, then into Kepler. From Kepler, that branches off in many directions, but you sort of get a culmination with people like Riemann, Dirichlet. You then have Einstein, Planck, and others. And then really a revolution took place with Vernadsky, where Vernadsky really was the first one to put forward in an explicit way, though others hinted at it, and you can actually find it in various expressions elsewhere. But he really made the science of the phase spaces, that life is a principle of the universe, not just an expression in the universe, that we live in a universe of a living character, and that as well we live in a universe which is of a cognitive character, and that we can investigate and must understand all of our previous knowledge, all of our previous understanding of the nature of the universe, now in terms of this Vernadskian conception of the nested phase spaces, of the ostensibly abiotic, the biological, and the noetic. And that it's the relationship among these three phase spaces which really characterizes the creative nature of the universe we live in. And then from Vernadsky, you then have really, I think, I would posit as the highest expression of all of that is what you have in Lyndon LaRouche's discoveries in the domain of physical economy, where now you have, I think, as far as I've seen, the most fruitful and conscious expression of the relationship of mind and the relationship of minds between each other as an artistic conception, and the relationship, the intimate relationship that has then to physical science. And that the fact that it's the marriage of the two unified under an intention that we find in economics, a credit-based economic system, where really the governing principle becomes the intention to push the creative process in the universe forward. That is the highest expression of science and culture. It's the intention to move the universe to higher states of organization, of creativity, and to really recognize metaphor as the ontological nature of substance in this universe. And so you can follow that arc, and we develop it, and we've put out many different videos, and we've constructed websites on the various aspects of Kepler's discoveries. So all of that should be available, and we'll continue to expand that content on the website. So I definitely say people must go there, but first and foremost, you have to first change your idea of your own nature to see the universe as reflecting your own creative potential. And in doing that, also recognizing that in order to express that fully, we must necessarily get this bum Obama out of the White House, stop this drive for World War III, and move forward with this credit system as has been proposed by Mr. LaRouche.
I'll just just amplify that a bit. Like Cody said, there does exist a curriculum. We called it the narrow path, and you can find good chunks of it on our website. We're trying to make the basement section of the LaRouche Pack website into something that can be used for guided pedagogy. But if you look at the character of any of these individuals in the current of real science, like Kepler, Plato, Gauss, Vernadsky himself, or LaRouche himself, science is inherently, and by science I mean the exertion of the creative ability to understand and then drive processes in the universe, drive universal principles. It's inherently revolutionary. which means that every single one of these guys, you don't have to be, inside of a Nazi concentration camp in order to do real science. But you have to recognize that what we're fighting against is a British Empire. It's a historic operation that goes back several thousand years, back to the time of Plato, who was himself an enemy of the existing oligarchy of the time. That's what his dialogues were for. They were composed as an act of war against the oligarchy. So I know personally, I'm sure anybody else here can say this too, unless you're actively fighting against the oligarchy or actively fighting for revolution, and right now that means dumping Obama, getting rid of the British Empire, setting up a credit system of cooperation between the major nations of the planet, and launching projects like NWAPA, the North American Water and Power Alliance, crafting the surface of the Earth so that we can get off the Earth and travel through the solar system and potentially the galaxy to control it and run it and drive it and make it become a better place. Unless that is your intent, then you're going to end up compromising on your education. And you find that real knowledge it's something you can't compromise on. Real knowledge is something that's rigorous and it's precise. It's precisely ambiguous, as some would say, but it's not something to play around with, right? You have to have a concept that human knowledge and the development of human powers over the universe are inherently revolutionary, which means that once you start on the track of this stuff, you end up becoming the enemy of some pretty big jerks on the planet, like the British Empire. So I would say take that into account too.
Okay, that brings us to the conclusion of today's webcast. I'd like to thank everybody who tuned in live to the webcast. It will be archived on the LaRouche PAC website. I'd also like to thank Cody and Peter for your contributions to our discussion today. We received many more questions than we could get to in the time that we have allocated, and Peter and Cody can respond to some of the questions that we received maybe by email over the course of the coming week. Please continue to send in your questions. We will be having another such event in the very short future ahead of us, and we plan on making this a regular feature of what we're doing on the LaRouche PAC website. However, one requirement to make that happen is we need you to contribute monetarily also. We need you to make a major contribution right now to contribute to our political fight and to contribute to allowing us to continue holding these types of events in the very near future. So thank you for watching, and this will be archived. You can spread it around to everybody that you know, and we hope to see you next time. So that brings the conclusion to today's webcast event.